The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds outside my window, and for a brief moment, I thought everything had settled. But when I stepped out onto the porch, there they were again. My neighbors, huddled together like a pack of conspirators. They weren't yelling this time, but the way they were whispering and glaring at me told me they hadn't given up. I could almost feel their eyes digging into me, trying to remind me that the battle wasn't over. I ignored them at first, sipping my coffee, breathing in the calm of the morning. But I knew in my gut, these folks weren't going to let it go. Some people can't stand when they lose, especially when they've been embarrassed in front of everyone. And yesterday, when my son, the sheriff, shut them down, they didn't just lose, they lost publicly. That kind of bruise doesn't heal quickly. As the day went on, I worked in my shed like I always did, hammering down a loose board and sharpening some tools. The smell of sawdust and oil filled the air, comforting and familiar. But every now and then I'd catch sight of them peeking around, pointing or shaking their heads. One even snapped a picture of the shed with his phone. I knew what that meant. They weren't finished. They were gathering evidence, trying to build a case against me. By the afternoon, I heard a knock on my door again. When I opened it, it wasn't my son this time. It was a man in a suit with a clipboard. He introduced himself as part of the Homeowners Association, the very group my neighbors had probably been feeding lies to. He started with a smile, but I could see the sharp edge behind it. "Sir," he said, "we've received complaints about an unauthorized structure on your property." He motioned toward the shed like it was some kind of criminal hiding in plain sight. I let him talk, nodding slowly, but inside I was boiling. Unauthorized structure? That shed was on my land, built by my hands, and had been there long before most of these neighbors even moved in. When he finally finished his lecture, I asked him calmly, "Did you check the property records?" He looked a little surprised. "Because if you had, you'd know this shed was approved years ago, before the new rules you're quoting even existed." He shifted uncomfortably, flipping through his clipboard like he might have missed something. The truth was, he probably didn't expect me to know my rights. Most people roll over when someone shows up with authority and paperwork, but not me. I've lived long enough, fought enough battles, and raised a sheriff of a son. I wasn't, about to be intimidated. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "Well, I'll need to double-check with the office, but we'll be in touch." He turned and left, and I could see my neighbors watching from across the street, frustrated that their latest move hadn't worked out. That night, I sat with my son at the kitchen table telling him what happened. He chuckled and shook his head. "Dad," he said, "you'd be surprised how many of my calls are about things just like this. People will fight harder over fences, trees, and sheds than they will over anything that actually matters." I could see the pride in his eyes, though. He knew I wasn't backing down, and maybe he admired it because it reminded him of himself. The days that followed turned into a strange little standoff. The neighbors stopped speaking to me altogether, except for the occasional snide remark when they walked by. They filed more complaints, but each time, nothing came of it. The shed wasn't breaking any laws, and every time they tried, my son reminded me, "They can't take away what's yours." But the tension didn't disappear. It grew thicker, like a rope pulling tighter with every passing day. One evening, I heard voices outside near the shed. I rushed out with a flashlight and caught two of the neighborhood kids messing around by the door. They scattered as soon as they saw me, but I knew whose idea it was. Their parents were sending them, trying to cause trouble, hoping maybe I'd lose my temper and give them something to use against me. Instead of blowing up, I decided to play it smart. I installed a small camera near the shed, just enough to catch anyone who thought about messing with it again. And sure enough, a couple of nights later, the same kids came back, trying to spray something on the wall. This time, I had them on video. The next morning, I walked over to their parents' house with a copy of the footage. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I just handed it to them and said, "Keep your kids off my property." The look on their faces was priceless, shock mixed with embarrassment. They had been caught red-handed, and there was no denying it. After that, the kids never came near my shed again. Through all of this, the shed became more than just wood and nails to me. It was a symbol, a line in the sand. Every time they tried to break me down, I stood taller. Every time they tried to push me out, I dug in deeper. And with my son standing behind me, both as a sheriff and as my boy, I felt untouchable. Still, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Sometimes late at night, I'd sit in that shed, surrounded by the tools and memories, and wonder why people can't just live and let live. Why is it so hard for some to respect what's not theirs? But then I'd remember the look on my neighbors' faces the day my son told them the shed was staying, and I'd smile. Because no matter how much they plotted, no matter how many complaints they filed, the shed still stood. And every morning when the sun rose and lit up that little wooden building in the yard, I felt the same thing. Pride. Pride in the work I'd done, pride in the stand I'd taken, and pride in the sheriff who called me Dad. The battle wasn't over, not yet. But with every passing day, I knew one thing for certain. They might have called the cops on my tool shed, but they picked the wrong man to fight. The sun was setting one evening when I felt the whole weight of this battle finally start to shift. For weeks, my neighbors had schemed, complained, and thrown everything they had at me, but nothing had worked. The shed still stood, and with it, so did my peace of mind. But they weren't finished. They wanted a victory, something to soothe their bruised egos. And I knew they had one more card to play. It came on a Friday night. I was sitting inside when I noticed flashing lights outside my window. Not just a patrol car this time, there were two, maybe three. My heart pounded as I stepped outside, and there they were, the same neighbors standing at the end of my driveway, smirking like they had finally won. The officers stepped out, and for a moment I thought, this is it. They've managed to twist the law in their favor. But then I saw who was leading them. My son. He had a serious look on his face, the kind he wore when he was on duty. But behind his eyes, I saw something else. He wasn't just here as the sheriff. He was here as my son, and that meant something. The neighbors wasted no time, rushing up. To him, waving papers, pointing at the shed like it was some monstrous violation. They accused me of everything from building without permits to disturbing the peace. They wanted me fined, punished, humiliated. One of them even shouted, "If you don't take it down, we'll take it down ourselves." I stood silently, arms crossed, waiting. My son let them rant, his face calm and unreadable. When they finally quieted down, he turned to me. "Dad," he said, "is there anything illegal about this shed?" I shook my head. "No, son. Built it fair and square. Years ago, with every approval I needed." He nodded, then looked back at the neighbors. "Then this conversation is over." The silence that followed was heavy, like the air itself froze. The neighbors blinked, their mouths opening and closing, but no words coming out. They had expected him to side with them, to play into their little power game. But instead, he had cut it down in one clean sentence. "You can't harass him anymore." My son continued. "You've wasted enough of my department's time, and if you keep filing false complaints, there will be consequences for you." His voice was steady, authoritative. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was the law. The neighbors' faces turned red with anger and embarrassment. Some stormed off without another word. Others muttered under their breath, but they knew it was over. They had picked a fight they couldn't win, and now it had backfired. When the patrol cars pulled away and the street grew quiet again, I stood there in the glow of the porch light, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. My son clapped me on the back and said, "You know, Dad, you've always been stubborn. Guess that's where I get it from." We both laughed, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like peace had truly returned. But as the days went by, I realized something important. This wasn't just about a tool shed. It was about standing your ground when you're right. It was about not letting petty people push you around just because they shout the loudest. And it was about family, because through it all, my son had my back. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit on the porch and watch the shed standing proudly in the yard, bathed in moonlight. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, but it meant everything. It was proof that I didn't bow down, that I held firm, that when they tried to tear me down, I stood taller. My neighbors never fully warmed up to me after that, but they stopped trying to tear me apart. They learned the hard way that some battles just aren't worth fighting. And deep down, I think they knew they'd underestimated me from the start. So, when people ask me about that shed, I don't just tell them it's where I keep my tools. I tell them it's a reminder. A reminder that what's yours is worth protecting, a reminder that family will always stand by you, and a reminder that sometimes the best victory isn't loud or flashy. It's simply standing firm when the world tries to push you over. They called the cops on my tool shed. They tried to tear me down. But what they didn't realize was this. The law was on my side, the truth was on my side, and most of all, my son, the sheriff, was on my side. And that, my friends, is why the shed still stands to this day. The first time I heard the loud banging on my door, I thought it was just the wind shaking the old screen. But when I stepped outside, 3 of my neighbors were standing there with their arms crossed and their faces tight with anger. They didn't even say hello. One of them, the loudest of the bunch, pointed toward the back of my property and shouted that my tool shed was a violation, that it was against the rules of the community, and that if I didn't remove it, they would call the sheriff. I looked at them calmly, because I had been through worse storms in my life than a few angry neighbors, and I simply said, "Go ahead and call." What they didn't know was that the sheriff they wanted to call was none other than my own son. The tension in the air that morning felt heavy, like the kind of weight you get before a summer storm. I walked back toward my tool shed, trying to keep my own temper from flaring. That shed had been there for years. I built it with my own hands. Every nail, every beam, every shelf inside it carried a piece of my sweat and my story. It wasn't just a place to store rakes and saws. It was where I fixed broken chairs, repaired the mower, and even built little birdhouses for my grandkids. To me, that shed was like an extension of my home. To them, it was apparently an eyesore. All day long, I could hear their whispers as they passed by on the street, shaking their heads and muttering under their breath. I ignored them at first, but inside me there was this slow burn building. I kept thinking, why can't people mind their own business? But I knew this wasn't about the shed. It was about control. It was about neighbors who thought they could push me around, and I've never been the kind of man to bow my head when I know I'm right. By evening, the threat turned into action. I was sitting on my porch, sipping a cup of coffee, when I saw one of them on the phone, pacing back and forth, pointing toward my yard. I didn't even need to guess who they were calling. My phone buzzed minutes later, and it was my son. He didn't sound angry. In fact, I could almost hear him laughing on the other end. "Dad," he said, "I just got a call that you're causing trouble with a tool shed. Should I come down and investigate?" I could picture the grin on his face as he said it. I laughed back and told him, "You do what you gotta do, Sheriff." Not long after, his patrol car rolled up slowly, the flashing lights making the street glow red and blue. The neighbors all gathered around, waiting for the law to take my side of the yard away from me. My son stepped out, tall and calm, his uniform neat, his badge shining in the setting sun. He greeted everyone politely, then walked over to me. "Dad," he said in a voice that carried just enough authority to make the neighbors perk up, "I hear we've got a tool shed problem." I crossed my arms and looked at him. "Well, son, you're the sheriff. What do you think?" He turned and looked at the shed for a long moment, walked around it, even peeked inside. Then he walked back toward the neighbors, who were waiting like vultures ready to pounce. "I don't see any crime here," he said. Looks like a well-built shed to me. In fact, it's probably sturdier than some houses I've seen. The look on their faces was priceless. Their mouths dropped open like fish gasping for air, and for a second, nobody said a word. That silence was golden to me. I could have left it at that, but my son wasn't finished. He stood tall, his hand resting near his belt, and told them firmly, "Folks, unless you have actual proof that this shed is breaking some real law, I'd advise you to let this matter go. You've got a good neighbor here who hasn't hurt anyone. Complaining about a shed isn't exactly the kind of crime this department is worried about." His words carried weight, and the neighbors knew it. They grumbled, shook their heads, and slowly began to walk away, defeated. I stood there beside my son, proud in a way only a father can be, not just because he was the sheriff who had my back, but because he handled the whole mess with grace and authority. He didn't lose his cool. He didn't insult anyone. He just spoke the truth and shut down the nonsense. And in that moment, I realized something important. Sometimes the best revenge is simply standing tall and letting the truth speak louder than the noise. Later that night, as I sat inside my tool shed with the light on and the smell of old wood, around me I thought about everything that had just happened. I thought about how neighbors can turn into enemies over something as small as a shed. I thought about how quick people are to call the cops when they want their way. And I thought about how lucky I was that when they did call, the man who showed up was not just the sheriff, but my son. It gave me this deep feeling of gratitude and pride that I can't even fully put into words. The shed stood strong under the moonlight, casting a shadow across the yard. To me, it wasn't just wood and nails. It was a symbol now, a reminder that no matter who tries to tear you down, if you build something with your own two hands and stand by it, you don't have to back down. The neighbors had tried to shame me, but in the end, they were the ones who walked away ashamed. And I knew, from that day forward, that she would stand there not just as a storage space, but as a story worth telling. The whole ordeal brought me closer to my son, too. When he left that night, he gave me a pat on the back and said, "Don't let them get under your skin, Dad. People like that are never satisfied." I nodded because I knew he was right. Some folks will always find something to complain about. But as long as I've got the truth on my side and the sheriff as my son, I'll sleep just fine. And so the story of the shed and the sheriff spread through the neighborhood, whispered in porches and kitchens, told with laughter and disbelief. Some neighbors learned their lesson and stopped picking fights. Others still held grudges, but they kept their distance. Either way, I had peace. And every time I see that patrol car drive by with my son behind the wheel, I remember that day, when they called the cops on my tool shed and realized they picked the wrong man to mess with.